like to say a couple words to get us started, and then we'll open up for discussion with the audience.
Well, first is congratulations to Peter and Oliver. It's been a spectacular. This is spectacular, and the whole series is a really powerful around the world, and a very important engagement. And the thing about that, I would say, and I take nothing away from Peter and Oliver, the responsibility to take initiatives is all of ours. And I mean, what we ought to learn is not only this is a powerful initiative, but what is it we each can do in our own realm to take the initiative to begin changing the story, changing the culture, and opening this a different direction. So that's first. Second is, as you all know, the President of the United States has approved $1 trillion nuclear advance for the next 30 years. Almost no press. And it's not been discussed. So this issue is not a historic issue. It is right now. And so the responsibility for that, I think, is all of ours. And then the question becomes, how do we actually act? Look in the mirror tomorrow morning and say, what is it I can do? And it's not a general question. It's very personal. The third thing I would say, which is, it's in the film, but I want to underline it. The U.S. military, so far as we know, were not for this decision. That is, indeed, at the Potsdam Conference, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, everybody knew that if you told the Japanese that they could keep their emperor, the war would end shortly after the Russians entered, and the Russians were expected in August. Important to know, there could not even be the first landing until November. 3 months. And the big invasion that Truman talks about couldn't happen until April of 1946. So the bomb was dropped on August 6th. There were 3 months left to test anything before anybody was going to land in the initial landing, which the estimates were something over 38,000, maybe, casualties. So what Truman was preventing was that, if he was preventing anything. U.S. intelligence and British intelligence, combined intelligence, estimated in the spring and summer of 1945, starting in April, that when the Russians came in, and we were desperately trying to bring them in because the bomb was uncertain, when the Russians come in, if you tell the Japanese they can keep the emperor, the war will end. That was the advice to the President of the United States. Secondly, the U.S. military always knew they wanted to keep the emperor. This was never in question. To keep order in Japan, the emperor was never going to go away. At Potsdam, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff begged the British Chiefs of Staff to get Churchill, to get Truman, to change the terms back to what everyone knew what the terms were. Tell them they can keep the emperor and the war will end. Get that picture. The U.S. military Chiefs of Staff couldn't get through Burns, the Secretary of State, so they got the British Chiefs of Staff to get Churchill to go back to Truman and say, tell them they can keep the emperor and the war will end. That's what the intelligence told them. This was nothing new. The whole Potsdam Declaration that was issued at that time included exactly that form, paragraph 12. That's what the plan was. They had to take it out of the declaration in order to use the bomb. So it was a calculated decision, and it was always aimed at the Russians. There's no dispute about that. I mean, there is dispute among historians, but the documents are very clear that it was always about the Russians and strengthening the hand, as the quote, as the film shows. And Jimmy Burns was the heart of that. In fact, almost every other major figure up to that point were defending this argument, that tell them they can keep the emperor and the war will end as of April. And so, also, there's an important point because, and I won't go much further, historians are really loose on this one. The conservative Republicans in the United States Congress, the leadership, were begging Truman to tell them they can keep the emperor. That was the Republican position. He would not have been attacked. That's a phony argument that was tossed in later. He would have been supported. And indeed, Hoover came to him with the support of the Republicans and said to him, and this is in May of 1945, said, look, tell him you can keep the emperor. We know the war is going to end. The Washington Post was screaming the same thing at that time, as were all conservative newspapers. So it was not a political decision, as is sometimes said, that he had to do it because the Republicans would have attacked him. That's just totally wrong. It's been made up after the fact. So the thing to worry about out of this is really how frail the decision-making process is and how weak it is, unless there is a citizen movement that builds up a serious capacity to challenge it. And that's the deep story of Hiroshima. So enough. Stop me. I'll go on and on. You stop me from.
Yes, please.
A couple of comments or questions. One, did the Democrats kind of lean the conservative way, and Republicans were viewed as more liberal during those days? Or is that unfounded?
No, I think that is unfounded. But on this issue, they were conservative in a different way. They wanted to keep the emperor. But the reason that the conservatives wanted to keep the emperor is because the emperor was a conservative figure, and they thought it would produce a conservative Japan. But they also wanted to end the war.
The follow-up question is this. Did military America observe the health of FDR, and did they play that in any way? Because FDR appeared to be frail. Do you have any indication that they thought or used that in any way?
I don't know that. Peter, have you seen that any indication?
About the military commenting, it was pretty clear to everybody who was around FDR that his days were limited. They did some special medical testing, and one of the doctors said that there's no way he's going to last this term. He probably won't even last another year. His hands were shaking. He looked very pale and frail. When he got back, the trip to Yalta took a lot out of him. And when he got back from there, it was clear to everybody he wasn't going to last. So the party bosses' thinking was that if they didn't get Wallace off the ticket, then Wallace would become the next president. And Wallace's views were so far to the left of anybody we've ever had near the presidency in this country. In some ways, certain views maybe that Thomas Jefferson had were pretty radical, but a lot of the other views Jefferson had were not very radical. Wallace would have been by far the most radical president of the United States.
As to whether the military actually, seeing him weak, moved in on that in a different way, I haven't seen evidence, but it is true that Roosevelt, in theory, opposed mass bombing of cities. I'm saying in theory because it didn't last for long. And both Tokyo and Dresden, of course, and Berlin, the order, I don't know, Peter, if you've ever seen when the order was actually changed at the highest level. That story is one that I haven't seen.
It actually starts in late 43.
With approval?
Yeah.
Presidential approval?
I don't know if Roosevelt weighed in, but he was responsible ultimately.
Yeah.
That's why even Stimson, we give Stimson a little bit of credit as being the adult in the room, as being the one who was reasonable, talking about not wanting the United States to get the reputation of outdoing Hitler in atrocities with our strategic bombing. But Stimson was responsible for that as Secretary of War. So he should have changed it. We shouldn't give him a moral pass on this because he bears a lot of the responsibility, even though later he does try to put the genie back in the bottle, as we say.
Does the closeness of Burns to Truman, did it play out in any way here?
Well, that's the story. That's the interest. Burns. The way to think about Burns is like Vice President Cheney. No, it really is. That here's a new president who Truman didn't know anything. He was literally out of the decision-making process. He was naive about what was being done. Roosevelt gave him no information. He was not a very interesting man. And the man who moved in on him was Burns, who treated him as a student. In fact, Truman was his student in the Senate. As a young senator, Burns kind of coached him along and brought him along. And for the first year, until Truman got, and the White House staff got rid of Burns, that's the way the game was played. So the key figure in the White House, I mean, the president during that period, if I'm exaggerating, was Burns for all foreign policy purposes.
Let me just add a little bit. That Truman had been vice president for 82 days before Roosevelt died. During those 82 days, Truman and Roosevelt had met twice. They never talked about anything of substance. One of the shocking things is that when Truman became president on April 12th, nobody had even had enough regard for Truman to tell him we were building an atomic bomb. So Truman doesn't find out till after he's sworn in at an emergency cabinet meeting that the United States is building an atomic bomb. So and in the beginning, the first few weeks, Truman, everybody he met with, Truman would say, "This is a terrible mistake. I'm not big enough. I'm not smart enough. Somebody else should become president." Finally, the majority leader, Barkley, came to him from the Senate and said, "People are losing faith in the presidency. At least make believe you're president and can take this job on." And then Truman started his change of attitude. The buck stops here, the tough guy who we all know of. But in the beginning, Truman was much more honest. He met with the press. He went to Congress, meet with the congressman the next day, and then he spoke to the press afterwards, and he said, "Boys, if you've ever had a load of hay fall on you, I feel as if the moon, the stars, and all the planets have fallen on me." Somebody said to him, "Good luck, Mr. President." And Truman says, "I wish you didn't have to call me that." So that was very clear in the beginning.
Hi.
They gave me the microphone.
Whoopsie. Hi.
I guess we have two. So let's take one
okay.
here and then one
Hi,
there.
I'm Paula Leroy. I'm Santa Cruz Wilf. A couple things. I'm wondering in number 2, did you talk about Pearl Harbor, the whole deal about it was perhaps not sort of a farce and that it could have been averted? And I'm wondering about the voices of women. What was Eleanor saying and doing all this time? I didn't hear any, hardly, except Dorothy Day, voice of women. What was going on there? And I wish that had been more of the film. And just one last thing. I'm wondering if all of us could apologize to Kazuhi since our president is not courageous enough, if we maybe could apologize. Could everybody stand up and face Kazuhi and apologize? Can we say it together? I apologize for what our government and our people did to your people.
I do. Well, coming from Japan, I do appreciate your apology. I mean, I'm not in any position to take it personally. I mean, I was watching, and I was thinking, the emperor could have done, could have ended it earlier. Well, my nationality is Japanese, but I don't necessarily think that it has to be, American citizen versus Japanese citizen. And I also personally would have liked to see, it was about the Pacific Theater in Tokyo, but earlier I talked about Okinawa, where people were sacrificed to save again the emperor. So in that, mainland Japanese is also responsible and feel guilty and apology to Okinawans. But and this is the war that Japan started in 1931, part of that. So I do appreciate your apology. Yes, I was disappointed when President Obama came to Hiroshima, and I appreciate his presence, but it was beautiful, but he started by saying that death fell from the sky when it was a bomb. Bomb is dropped by somebody, and so that's what I was thinking. So I just wanted to share. But thank you very much.
I might add just one small point. In 1995, a poll was taken, the U.S. poll, and over 50% of the Americans said both sides should apologize for the beginning and the end of the war. So the culture may be at least more open at that point.
I have the microphone. I'll use it, okay. Anyway, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my father was a doctor who practiced right near the White House. And he always told me that everybody knew that Roosevelt was dying. And one of the reasons was that he insisted
that he have Navy doctors, because he'd been a Navy man, and the Army doctors were much better. But I have something else I want to say. My family was very involved in the Progressive Party, and I went to the first Progressive Party convention. And when we're worried about, is there going to be a spinoff? Is there going to be a spinoff from the Bernie Sanders campaign? I'll tell you a wonderful spinoff from the Henry Wallace campaign and the Progressive Party. Washington at that time, in 1948, when I was 13 years old, was a completely segregated city. And black and white people that never got together in Washington got together to decide to desegregate the eating establishments in Washington. Everything was segregated. The water fountains, you just name it, the swimming pools, everything was a southern city. And my mother went, and she took me as a 13-year-old. Every Wednesday, the woman went and picketed the Heck Company. And they used Joe Forer, who was a famous lawyer. They took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court went back to the time when the city was incorporated after the Civil War, and said that then the restaurants were then desegregated. Nothing else was desegregated then. But the spinoff from the Progressive Party was that the restaurants in Washington were desegregated. Now, Mary Church Terrell, who is a very famous, extremely well-educated...
Is there a question there?
Yeah, no, but I just want to tell you that...
I think we want to move on to questions.
Mary Church Terrell was one of the original Wilf people, and she came to meetings at my parents' house, and in her late 70s, she was a very old lady, she agreed to be a test person to test whether the restaurants were really desegregated. That's all I want to say. But that was a spin-off from the Progressive Party.
Alice.
Have a question?
Yes, I have a question. I noticed that you did include in your film, which I think is so important, what happened at the Smithsonian in 1995, which I understood that Congress fired the historian. Is that your understanding?
Congress wasn't the one who fired him. That's Martin Harwood, who was the head of the Air and Space Museum. But
At their pressure,
well,
right?
Congress put pressure. Congress passed resolutions condemning what was happening there, and Congress threatened to cut off funding to the Smithsonian if it had an honest exhibit about the decision to drop the bomb.
Right, and then I wanted to know if you're familiar with you must be, Hiroshima Shadow by Kai Bird and Larry Lifshitz, who are historians.
Yeah, sure.
And I think, can you figure out some way to just mention it? Because when people hear about the Smithsonian and you read that book, you see what evidence we have.
There were several good books written that discussed the Enola Gay controversy. We had invited Kai to join us tonight. So Kai was going to be on the panel, except his wife has some health issues, so he wasn't able to make it tonight. But Kai, we also invited Marty Sherwin. And Kai Bird and Marty Sherwin wrote a terrific biography of Robert Oppenheimer, American Prometheus, that won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. So we strongly recommend that also. There is in the book.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, Gar. Tad Daly's my name. I've been staffing the table out here for Citizens for Global Solutions. And check this out. We were founded in 1947 as the United World Federalists. And I think I have this right. One of our founding board members was Henry Wallace.
Yeah.
I know that Henry Wallace spoke very openly about world government as the solution to the new problem of atomic weapons and the ancient problem of war itself. And there were other flashes of that in your film. It's not really what your film is about. The book that you showed called One World or None, in that book, Leo Szilard from your film, Hap Arnold, five-star general, Albert Einstein, wrote so unambiguously about world government as the ultimate thing that the human race should strive for and the solution to the problem of war. You guys are both real historians and know this period. Could you speak a little bit about that idea of world government, which for a very brief moment after the Second World War really captured the imagination of a lot of folks?
There's a wonderful book by our friend Paul Boyer called By the Bomb's Early Light. And Paul has an excellent chapter in there. I know the people who are writing on the subject. What the bomb made clear was that the idea of national sovereignty was outdated. People were trying, when we look at this period, since 1945, one of the remarkable things is that we're still here. And it's not because of our wisdom as a species. Sometimes it was pure blind luck. We came within a hair's breadth of being blown up during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You should see our episode on the Cuban Missile Crisis. If the Soviet sub-commander Arkhipov hadn't talked the other commander down, the Soviets were about to launch their nuclear torpedo. The order had been given to launch the nuclear torpedo. World War III was going to start right then. We've had so many dangerous incidents, which is why now the bulletin atomic scientists' doomsday clock is back to, I think, 3 minutes to midnight. So it's quite dangerous. You look at the kinds of thinking that, well, we know the choice in this election. Either way, we're screwed. But some of the crazy stuff that Donald Trump has been saying, where he's actually called for nuclear proliferation. He said that the South Koreans and the Japanese should develop their own nuclear weapons. He's been very frustrated. He said, what's the point of having nuclear weapons if we can't use them? And he said, we want to be able to use them again. And he's also been very supportive of Harry Truman's decision. Hillary Clinton is not quite as crazy on this issue, but she's crazy enough on other issues that in either case, we're going to look back fondly on Barack Obama, probably. At least there's a modicum of sanity there. Now, when we talk about Obama's visit to Hiroshima, I was calling for this from 2008 that Obama should go there. I wish he had given his Prague speech in Hiroshima. That would have been much more meaningful. But the thing is, we had an interesting comment that the first sentence in that speech Obama gave, history fell from the skies, that was one of the lies. But there's even, I think, a worse lie there. In that speech, he says, we have to look directly into the eye of history. Then he goes on and says, the World War II reached its brutal end in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As we show here, and as Gar has shown in his books, that's not true, right? That's the myth. That's one of the 2 or 3 fundamental myths of World War II that the American public still buys. And that's why we're challenging that so directly.
Just 2 points on this. Yes. Two points on this just to stress. The world government issue, I think, still is present. But the first place is the United States is the leader on all of this. The whole power game is being written. And so that the responsibility is here. I mean, here in this room and amongst anybody who cares, to get the U.S. policy to back down. It's been pushing the arms race continuously. And with the $1 trillion, so it's our responsibility. The world government issue comes forward. It's a whole other set of questions. But this is the problem we face right now. And I just want to underline that I don't like to get lost in the other piece.
The film is so enlightening and so moving. I really just thank you for
Thank you.
doing it.
3 quick questions. Number 1, what will the $1 trillion actually be spent doing? I don't understand the modernization. Does it include testing and all that kind of stuff? Number 2, where is this series being shown? And number 3, give us one action to do immediately.
The danger about this $1 trillion modernization is that every single aspect of our nuclear arsenal is being modernized. The idea is that it's going to make nuclear weapons more usable. We're going to miniaturize them the way that Goldwater and Bush both were calling for, and the idea is to make them more usable. Now, what is the thinking of a Barack Obama? Right? Obama knows better. When he was a student at Columbia, he marched in Central Park with 1 million other people in 1982. He's written about this issue. It seems to be one of the issues he actually cares deeply about. And yet this blindness here with this is so dangerous, this modernization program. Gar, did you want to?
Well, no, it's true. I mean, I obviously, given the choices, I was for Barack Obama and still support many of the things he did. But he chose not to take on this issue. It isn't that he didn't take on this issue. He chose not to take on this issue, and that's a major failing. And bringing that to light is critical, and we didn't hear anything about it from Bernie. So the that issue will not be brought to light unless citizen actions bring it to light.
Yeah. If it's being shown all over the world. It's going to be, well, our contract with Showtime and CBS ended, so now it's going up next month on Netflix. So, but the whole series is, the whole thing, all 12 episodes, is available for like $18 or less at Amazon. So you can buy them all, Blu-ray or DVD, very, very inexpensively.
We're going to go here and then over here.
The question
Yeah,
is,
it's an 800-page book also.
Claire Hanrahan from North Carolina. The question about what to do next is 30 years. The Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance has been active right on the ground where those very weapons are being refurbished. And we had in our room, and I wonder if she's still here, Sister Megan Rice, who paid a very high price for revealing the insecurity of that base with a great action. But please support the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance and read their website, and you'll understand what's being talked about. Thank you.
Okay, right over here.
Yes, I'm Alan Haber. So we see the myth continuing from 1945, its effect on American consciousness, that all this is somehow justified and honorable men and so on, and difficult questions. We see just that Mr. Obama chooses not to raise certain questions. Well, I think the question we need to raise is what happened in 9/11, who did it, how is the U.S. government internally involved, what is the role of the Israelis? If we actually got information, like you guys have been analyzing, out into the public, the support for the United States government and its internal policies would evaporate. We have been attacked by ourselves. This war on terror is our own war to advance policies advanced by the Israelis from the 80s, by the Bush New American Centuries in the 90s, and when they had their new Pearl Harbor that they called for, and you think they didn't try and do it, they are doers. So how do we deal with 9/11, which is the disempowering, the cognitive dissonance that makes people not understand, as the man said there, how come this complacency? Because people do not know how to deal with what is actually going on because the myths of now are not being taken care of. Would you please talk about that, please?
I will talk. Let me just say we don't have time to give you a full. I do have an answer on that I think is really critical. At least I think is critical, and because the nuclear issue has disappeared, as many issues have disappeared, and people say, "What can you do?" And this is also true in politics as well. What Bernie did show is there's something brewing underneath that maybe can be tapped, and that's important to know on nuclear issues as well. And one of the ways that happens, and I think I take my hat off to the women's movement of the 1960s, and how do you which was a cultural revolution of extraordinary power. People don't realize, but how difficult that was. I mean, a cultural revolution of that scale is extraordinarily hard to achieve. So, what was the technique? What's the how-to? The how-to, and this can be done by anybody sitting in your seat. The how-to is you get 5 or 6 friends together in your living room, you get some pizza, you start reading about this, and you say, what can we 6 do here? And then you do it and support each other. And that's how you begin to get these things going. It doesn't happen any abstract way up in the sky. Books can be written, films can be written, but in the end it comes down to people saying, we're going to do some damn thing. So I want to encourage people not to ask the experts about this, but to say, what the hell can we do? And do it in small groups. And then say, let's try something. And somebody will pull off the next step that begins to, that's Black Lives Matter starts that way. They all start that way.
Now, Gar knows something about this. One of the books that I assign to my students is the book by Todd Gitlin, the former president of SDS, called The 60s. And in that book, Gitlin and his friends from Harvard went down to the Senate. Gar was working in the Senate at the time, and they met with Gar to get ideas about how to organize. And Gitlin calls the process of organizing Alpervitzing. That was a strategy that they learned from Gar back in the 1960s. His wisdom is just as relevant today.
Well, let me just make the central point was of it, because they want to know how you influence Congress. And they came to say, tell the congressman, tell the senator to do X, Y, Z. And I said, the way it works is congressmen and senators are like weather vanes, except in certain principled exceptions. You go back home and make the wind blow, and you'll get an answer. Don't talk to me. So that's what Todd was talking about in that book. I thought it was pretty obvious. But it's the same question for all of us.
Over here. I'm Michael Beer. Thank you for your work. In order to ban the bomb, we have to say that it can never be used on any ethical or grounds. And of course, we have two major arguments for the use of nuclear weapons. One is the Hiroshima-Nagasaki myth. The other is the Cold War myth that the United States won the war in part with nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union collapsed because of the tremendous expense. Do we have a really strong set of films? Has somebody gone and got Gorbachev on the record very clearly to really take down this second pillar myth that keeps this nuclear bomb alive?
That theme runs throughout the entire series of the Untold History of the United States. I was very proud that the first blurb we got for the back of the book and documentary was from Gorbachev himself, who said that this is absolutely indispensable. The second blurb we got was from Bill Maher, and the third was from Dan Ellsberg, and then the historians started to weigh in. The whole fantasy about nuclear deterrence is the one that'll someday do us in. Right? Nuclear deterrence works until it doesn't work, and then there's nobody left to say that it didn't work. Yeah. Right? And we've come so close so many times. Right now, there are still 15,350 nuclear weapons in the world. I think we know about all the nuclear weapons, but the recent study by the International Physicians Against Nuclear War was that even a very limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, in which simply 100 nuclear weapons would cause partial nuclear winter, lead to starvation and famine for a decade, and 2 billion deaths. And that's from 100 nuclear weapons being used. We've still got 15,350, approximately. So the danger is with us. But the problem, Gar started to mention before, that I know on this campus, the young people do not understand this problem. Since the end of the Cold War, their focus has been elsewhere. It's great that they focus on global warming and the environment, and that's really important, Black Lives Matter and other issues. But bringing this question back to the consciousness of the public in general, as Gar said, it hasn't happened during this campaign. These issues haven't been talked about, and it behooves us, again, to make people care about this and realize that in the long run, climate change can kill us off. But in the short run, the nuclear, this is the main threat that's posed to us. Yeah.
And let me just stress that, because it isn't happening now does not mean that we cannot get an explosion of activity. That's a historical phenomenon that repeats and repeats and repeats. So discouragement, this moment, is self-denying. And so we're our own worst enemies in this respect. I'm not a utopian optimist, but I'm a historian, and you see this regularly repeated. People say nothing can be done. Now, let me give you my example. I'm from Wisconsin. I was brought up during the McCarthy era. If you lived in Wisconsin in the McCarthy era, one thing you knew is nothing could ever change. They shot anything that moved politically. And then the 60s exploded the next day. So do not take the moment of time that says nothing's happening as inevitable. One other piece on the Cold War. This hasn't been understood properly, but the deal that was going to be cut after World War II and was the plan from Yalta to Potsdam was the Germans had to be controlled. In the U.S. theory, they started 2 world wars. That's complex theory. So in the Russian theory as well. The U.S. and the Russians had a joint interest in keeping down the Germans. The Yalta Agreement was to keep down the Germans, and then the Russians could ease up in Eastern Europe because they knew they weren't going to be invaded. That was the deal. The atomic bomb blew that deal out of the water because we didn't need the Russians to control the Germans. We used the atomic bomb, and we saw the atomic bomb, and we started rebuilding Germany, and the Russians saw that as obviously threatening. So the whole bomb is at the heart of the Cold War capacities strategically. Now, that's a long strategic analysis. I take it on in length in my book, but it's not understood that the Cold War itself comes out of the change in power relationships that the bomb facilitated, did not make inevitable, because the Truman administration and his various advisors took advantage of it to use it that way as a threat, that to build up Germany and threaten the Russians with it.
Let me just add a tiny bit on that. What we try to do in Untold History is stress the importance of understanding history, arguing that history is not something about the past, but that the way people understand history shapes the way they act now and in the future. And we start in a large way with World War II, because the myths about World War II are so fundamental. One is about the atomic bomb. Another fundamental myth about World War II is that the Americans won the war in Europe. Now, that seems crazy to most of you, I'm sure, but talk to students or other people, and that's what Americans believe. The reality, of course, is that the Soviets won World War II in Europe. And I do an anonymous survey, and I ask my students and other college students, how many Americans died in World War II? The median answer I get was 90,000. There's only 300,000 off, not too bad. I asked them, how many Soviets died in World War II? The median answer I get is 100,000, which means they're only 27 million off, right? Which means they don't understand anything about the Cold War, what's happening now in Ukraine, what's going on in the world. And so this is very dangerous. And I try to make them understand this, that the number we lost on 9/11, get back to 9/11, under 3,000, or approximately 3,000, that's the equivalent of the Soviet loss of 27 million people is the equivalent of one 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years. And unless you can conceptualize that, you cannot understand how the Soviets view the world. One of the great things about Henry Wallace was that he could see the world through the eyes of our adversaries. When was the last time Kennedy, in his last year of his presidency maybe, but it's such a rare commodity to be able to do that. And that's why we have to study history, understand history, and use those lessons in an appropriate way. I think we've only got time for one more question.
Just had her hand up the longest. I'm sorry.
Okay. Lori Timmerman. And one of the things that could be shown maybe in your next sequel is about the, and I'm going to see if you're interested, the Hanford story of making the plutonium. And Kate Brown has a new book called Plutopia, which would be a great TV line. But I'm originally from Oregon, and so I'm talking about this $1 trillion in Congress, which caught me completely by surprise. And from Oregon, we had Senator Mark Hatfield, who witnessed the devastation. So wasn't there anyone in the Senate that remembered what, Hatfield did all these nuclear moratoriums. So how could that slip through the Congress and the Senate?
I'm sorry, what exactly is the question? Yes.
Senator Hatfield sponsored nuclear moratoriums all along.
Yes.
And why was there no one of his caliber opposing this in the Congress?
I don't know the answer to why there was no one, but I think there are 3 or 4 who we could actually begin to get taking on this issue now. We're going to get a good senator from Wisconsin coming back. Elizabeth Warren has not, to my knowledge, spoken about this issue, but probably could. We certainly could get Bernie onto this issue. And I think that there is a possibility of getting some leadership. Why it happens if people begin to urge it and develop it and push it along and get it going again. Hatfield does one, yes.
And you talk about another episode of Untold History. We'll have to share one story with you. I was up in New York last week for the premiere of Oliver Stone's movie Snowden. And I got introduced first of all, the stars in that all love Untold History and have been following every episode and many times. But I got introduced at the party afterwards to Snowden's father. And he got very excited to meet me. He said, "Oh, I love Untold History. It's the best thing that's ever been done." And he said, "I have to tell you a story. On the way from the screening to the party," he says, "I was just interviewed by Amy Goodman. And she asked me, what should Oliver Stone do for his next project?" And I said, Edward Snowden's father says, "Another episode of Untold History."
Yeah.
So that was music to my ears. I loved hearing it.
A great way to end.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can you do one more?
Yes, excuse me. I'd like to ask a question. I was a serious student of Soviet studies and Russian history. For every one American that died, 20 Russians died in World War II. I was in Moscow in 1997 when NATO went into Poland. I thought, what are we doing? The first word I learned in 1962 before the Cuban Missile Crisis was xenophobia. Forget about the Mongols 1,000 years ago when the Russians were in Kiev and so forth, but think of Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, Adolf Hitler. The Russians have been attacked 3 times in the last 200 years. They do not like people coming from the West. NATO was to stop them from coming west.
Your question?
And the question is, why didn't you include the Comintern meetings? The purpose of the Comintern meetings, of which there were 7 beginning in 1917, 18, 19, the last one was in 1935, the purpose of which was to spread worldwide communism, and agents were sent around the world. And I'm not interested in a dictatorship of the proletariat or gulags, but I support your efforts, despite what I've just said. But that's left out. The Comintern meetings, the purpose of spreading worldwide communism. Why was that left out?
Well, because each episode is 58 minutes and 30 seconds. And the first draft I gave to Oliver, each one would be over 3 hours, right? And that's if he read them as a New Yorker on speed, not at a speed that people could actually comprehend. And so there are 12 episodes. We do talk about it so much more. This is just one that was going to focus on the decision to drop the bomb, which Oliver and I think is the fundamental starting point, as Gar says, about the history of the American empire and where we've gone so badly wrong. So that's why we focus on this, and we're very limited. So much more information. Gar's got a book, about 700 pages on this subject. Untold History is 800 pages. There's a lot, so much more we would have loved to include if we had more time. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time. We're starting back up in the morning. Thank you all for staying.